Morning, everyone, and welcome to this Bisocial Canada webinar, Voices of Industry, a Paradigm Shift in CBAs. We've got a really exciting conversation for today, sharing some findings from new research that we've done on community benefit agreements that was funded by ESDC, and then a panel discussion as well. And there will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat throughout or save them for the end. And before we get any further into this day, I would like to just share that I live, work, and learn on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I endeavor to make this recognition more than just words. And I encourage and invite all of you to consider what it means to live on the traditional lands of your community, and what efforts we can all take to repair and improve relations with Indigenous peoples locally and globally. So to get us started, I'm going to invite David LePage to join me and share a bit of the context of how CBAs came to be and how they fit into social procurement as an entire movement. So David, tell us about how this all got started and what they do.
And you asked me to do that in 3 to 5 minutes.
Exactly.
Who knows me thinks that's going to be an impossible thing. Bob is already laughing. So I think the thing that we have to do is try to put the community benefit agreements in the context of social procurement. And when we think about social procurement, it's that realization that every time that we spend money, when we purchase things, and now when we build buildings or we build infrastructure, all of those decisions have a ripple effect. They have multiplier effects. They have externalities that happen. So when we do things like major infrastructure, we know that there's economic impacts. We know that there's employment impacts. We know there's social impacts, cultural and environmental impacts. So when we think about community benefit agreements, it really comes out of that context that infrastructure is being done all the time. And it just happens because we have to build cities, we have to build communities, we build hospitals, we build roads, we build big things. And one of the first community benefit agreements actually came out of the Staples Center in Los Angeles, where they were going to build a basketball court in an inner city area. And they said, we have jobs for people. And the community said, well, before we do that, could we get a daycare center? And they said, no, we're building a basketball court. And they said, well, we can't, and we're going to give you jobs. They said, well, we're not going to get to the job unless we have daycare. So it really was a discussion of that impact. And we look today, and it's interesting in the history, like Emma, you and I live, in Vancouver, and we look at when the viaducts were built in the 60s and 70s, it actually displaced, the Black community that was in Vancouver. So what happens many times is there are social and cultural and economic impacts that are not necessarily the best thing for a community. They're not building community. Oftentimes in infrastructure, historically, development happened because it was on available land. So in Vancouver, when the 2010 Olympics were coming, in 2004, the city put land up for sale that was available, and developers then bought the land to build the Olympic Village. The community from the downtown east side said, what's the impact going to be, and how can we get some benefit? How can we get some jobs? How can we get some local procurement? I think we're going to hear later from Kumsa and the whole power of community in Toronto to be able to look at the major infrastructure investment in transit, and how can, when we invest federal dollars, when we invest developer dollars, private dollars, public dollars in major construction and infrastructure, how can we ensure through a collaborative and planned method that we're building and contributing to communities? We're creating jobs, we're creating training and apprenticeships, we're building a social value supply chain. So recognizing, and we often think about this, that construction is not just the building of the structure. that all of this infrastructure, all of the cement or the wood or steel that goes into it is one piece, but it always has the potential to contribute to building community. So how do we do that intentionally? And community benefit agreements are designed that if community owners, government, and the construction industry work together, we really can use infrastructure to create healthy communities.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's such a great overview of how we're getting to where we are now and what it really means. And so to share a little bit more about kind of the trajectory that CBAs are on, our executive director, Liz, is going to share some key findings from new research. So Liz, I'd love for you to take it away.
Thanks, Emma. I am going to share some slides to help us walk through the key findings. So before doing that, as David was saying, this research took place earlier this year, and it really took place in the context of an emergence of social procurement and community benefit agreements across the country. Some of the examples that David spoke to, that's a decade's worth of learning and experience. And particularly over the last few years, we're starting to see across all levels of government, this development of policy at the federal level, the Community Employment Benefit Initiative, for example, at the municipal level. We're starting to see this recognition that when within the community we have social goals of reducing poverty or increasing employment opportunities, how are we leveraging the infrastructure and development projects happening at that community level to start to address some of those issues? We're seeing that recognition at institutions, BC Housing, for example, with a voluntary community benefit agreement on a project in Vancouver, and York University recognizing that as an institution set into the community, how through their construction projects do they implement and identify employment and procurement opportunities. And we started to see that recognition, as David was saying, at the corporate level when we're speaking to construction companies. When they're building a school, they're not just building a building, they're building an institution within the community where the youth are going to come and learn. And in the build phase, what's the opportunity to build in that additional social value so that it's contributing towards the community? And so as we're seeing that policy develop and be put into practice, we're starting to see what some of those possibilities are and what some of those outcomes can be. So Vancouver Island Construction Association, for example, finding that on $1 million contract, local suppliers create pretty much double the amount of jobs compared to where that's a multinational corporation. And so that's the context that we're in. If we're starting to see that these outcomes are possible on projects, then the context of the research looking at the opportunities and challenges to contribute towards and support workforce and apprenticeship diversity, the research was starting to look at how do we more intentionally leverage these sorts of outcomes. And so the research, as Emma mentioned, if folks haven't read this yet, we'll share around the link after this webinar, but the process that we went through here was exploring policy and literature, so looking at examples both across Canada and internationally, but then also starting to speak to folks from a wide range of sectors, so speaking to the construction associations, general contractors, the community benefit networks, local social enterprises, to start to hear what are these experiences of community benefit agreements and what are the perspectives on those opportunities and challenges. And then to put that into the context and examples, that's where we looked at 3 case studies. So we wanted to look at a diverse range, looking at urban settings, rural settings, as David mentioned, looking at investment where it's public infrastructure and private developments. And so I'm looking forward to going into those a little bit more with Emma and Jamie and Kumsa. And so to touch on some of the key findings that came out of the research, the first was that there's a real shift or an evolution in the perspective of CBAs and the opinion on CBAs across sectors. So even a couple of years ago, and again, as we kind of already mentioned, there's a history and background and experience to CBAs. And so we may have been hearing more voices or expected to hear more voices around opposition or hesitancy in relation to CBAs. But as we've seen that evolution of experience and understanding of CBAs, Jamie, for example, saying that CBAs are themselves playing a role in shifting that culture of the construction industry. And so actually what we found is that as part of that evolution, folks were not just even really neutral on CBAs, but we can see here, for example, being strong advocates for community benefit agreements on construction and infrastructure and development projects. And part of that is recognizing that community benefit agreements are beneficial for all of the stakeholders involved. So we touched, for example, when we're looking at the policy side of things, government's looking at how does that relate to the social objectives that they have. Community looking at how are we getting good jobs, how are we getting procurement opportunities for local businesses. And for the construction sector, recognizing that 46% of the construction industry is expected to retire in the next 8 years, we need to find new solutions to help address that labor market pressure. And so this recognition that social procurement and community benefit agreements are opening up that pool of opportunity. And for the construction sector is an opportunity to start to address some of those labor market pressures. So really, I think one of the key findings that started to come through was that nuance, the nuance of definition and the nuance of experience. So before jumping into what the opportunities and challenges were, we were asking folks, what are CBAs? What would you define as a CBA? What is your experience of that? And so there was some consistency that came through. There was a general recognition of the role of community and using community broadly to recognize that broad range of stakeholders, be that businesses, community benefit networks, individuals that understand the local context. There was also a recognition of, as we've said, if every dollar we spend has a social, environmental, and cultural impact, how do we leverage that beyond that economic impact? But the nuance came through in what folks had experienced on CBAs. So it was helpful to start to delve a little bit deeper as we go beyond just, do you agree or do you like CBAs or not? But to actually ask folks, what is your experience of CBAs? What's been working? What hasn't been working? And so to be able to understand that where, for example, folks had experienced prescriptive quotas, where they'd experienced a CBA that didn't recognize the local community needs, the needs of the project, didn't match those two things together, that's where that perspective or perception of CBAs wasn't as positive. And so one of the key things that came out, which I think is why we're particularly excited to be having these sorts of conversations today, is as we start to develop that experience and the number of community benefit agreements, we're seeing that there's a gap in the reporting and measuring and the sharing of those learnings. We see that as the CBAs grow and as we develop those reporting and measurement processes, that's where we're able to start to tease out some of that nuance. That's where we're able to start to identify in this community, what is the baseline? What can the market take right now? What are they looking to build in terms of capacity? And so it was highlighted by a lot of the interviewees across a range of sectors that it's so important to have these spaces where we start to come together and talk about what is the experience on CBAs, what's working and what can we continue to develop. And through having that conversation, one of the key things that came out was the importance of setting targets that are appropriate to supply and demand. So when we're thinking about that nuance that I mentioned and folks experiencing prescriptive quotas, what came through was that there's a real opportunity to work together to identify what is the project need, what's the community capacity, and how do we start to match those? How do we come together in a space to make sure that the community benefit agreement is supportive and is positive for all of those key stakeholders? So that's a really quick summary of some of those key findings. And it ultimately led, I think, to that overall key finding of the importance of communication, co-creation, and collaboration. really ensuring that as the policies are developed and we look to put them into practice, how are we ensuring that we're matching that supply and demand? How are we bringing folks into spaces to co-create what a successful CBA looks like in that context, and then ensuring that we're monitoring and reporting on that so that we're developing that learning, we're developing that experience, and ensuring that moving forward, we continue to grow the success of the CBAs. So Emma, that I think is a nice segue into talking a little bit more about what that's looking like in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Such a great overview of a very long report that we put together. So I think now we're going to bring on some panelists to have a discussion about the 3 case studies that we featured in this research in the report, getting some key industry perspectives on what's happening. And before we dive into that, I just want to introduce both the case studies in brief and the speakers so that they don't have to give you the full rundown of everything before we dive into some questions. So to start, we looked at 3 different cases. The first is Metrolinx in Toronto. And Metrolinx is an agency of the Ontario government that coordinates and integrates modes of transportation for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. They changed it. It used to just be the GTA, now it's the GTHA, I guess, at least for Metrolinx. And they're currently applying it on at least 3 light rail projects in that region, with aspirational hiring targets that 10% of all trade hours go to apprentices and 10% go to persons from historically disadvantaged and diverse groups. They also, in the CBA framework, require general contractors to practice social procurement, sending money to social and local or minority-owned businesses, but there is no target set for that spend. And to tell us more about Metrolinx, we're joined by Kumsa Baker, who's the Director of Campaigns for TCBN, the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Kumsa has supported the development of CBAs as part of large-scale public and private development projects, including the Metrolinx projects. And he's also actively involved in supporting CBA policy development at all 3 levels of government. We're also going to look at the Vancouver CBA policy. So Vancouver was the first major city in Canada to introduce a formal CBA policy in October of 2018, which was first tested through a pilot phase. Projects with that CBA must demonstrate best efforts in meeting the following targets. So they have 10% local and inclusive employment, 10% social procurement, and 10% local procurement. And the CBA is triggered on any redevelopments over 45,000 square meters of floor space, so quite large redevelopments. Targets apply to the pre-build, build, and operations phases of these projects. And the city uses all of their permitting and licensing measures to enforce these targets. But of course, best efforts are allowed for. And Liz is going to share about Vancouver. As Executive Director of Bisocial Canada, she coordinates and connects a lot of Bisocial Canada's work with public and private sector purchasers, including all levels of government, SAP, and Chandos Construction, to design and implement social procurement and CBA policies and practices. And she has worked with the City of Vancouver to develop the policy that we're discussing today, and also works on implementation with several owners and developers right now. And then thirdly, we'll also look at the Comox Valley Regional District, where they applied a community employment benefit to a wastewater treatment project in 2018. So this is an initiative set up by Infrastructure Canada on where federal funding is received over a certain threshold, this initiative is applied. And implicated projects provide employment or procurement opportunities for at least 3 of the targeted groups of the initiative, which are apprentices, Indigenous peoples, women, persons with disabilities, veterans, youth, recent immigrants, and small, medium, or social enterprises. So Comox Valley Regional District represents a collection of small rural communities on the east coast of Vancouver Island in BC. And they accepted federal grant funding with this requirement for this wastewater treatment facility. Because this was the first CEB they administered, they asked proponents, which in this case was Aecon, the successful developer, to establish and report on a baseline number of target hours. And then there were heavy financial penalties if those hours weren't met. So to speak about that, we're going to hear from Jamie Abernethy, who's a project director for AECON Water Infrastructure. And Jamie is an experienced project director with a strong commercial background and a demonstrated history of working in the construction industry. And on this project in particular, he was project manager, applying the CEB as well as the general oversight as a general contractor. So to get us started, Jamie, I'd love to hear a bit more about AECON's role on this project and also what the RFP process was like for your team.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction and invitation to this panel. It was an interesting process because we went through the RFP process in around 2019, and so it was early on, and I don't think there was a lot of directives that were established at that point. So as we worked through the RFP, we were trying to figure this out with the owner. And as you mentioned, we had to actually establish these targets. So there was probably more RFIs issued about this initiative than the rest of the project itself, because there just wasn't a lot of direction, and it was relatively new for everyone. And so there was a lot of feeling out, but it was one of those things that I think, the owner was very collaborative. They were willing to work with us, and the fact that we were able to have these discussions at the RFP phase as opposed to after the fact was really beneficial in working out an arrangement that worked for everyone. And in the end, I was pretty happy that we were able to overachieve on those targets. And I think, it was a very successful project from that standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And your point about being able to negotiate in advance of the contract is definitely something I think we saw reflected in the research, that when it's something that's applied after you've already signed a contract, and it makes a really big difference on how CBAs are perceived.
Yeah, and especially just kind of in the early phases of this, as people are trying to figure everything out, there needs to be some opportunity for that discussion to make sure that, it can be successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then Kumsa, I'd love to hear, I'm talking about the Metrolinx projects. I think it's really important to acknowledge that TCBN played a crucial role in getting these CBAs applied on major projects by Metrolinx. And so I'd love to hear a bit more about why that was so important to you and what you think is the role of community in these projects.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kumsa with the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Yeah, it's such a great question. At the time, Metrolinx was really involved in a quite enormous program to build transit in our city. I think, with the growing city, there was a huge need to, build important infrastructure like transit. But what we also saw was that, these projects were going to be bringing lots of opportunities also into these communities. Specifically for the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, it was a light rail transit project that was going to impact many neighborhoods across the city of Toronto, including 8 neighborhood improvement areas that the city of Toronto had identified. And so as part of the work that we did with TCBN is really, how do we engage, these local communities and especially into the early planning stages. We know sometimes with development, there could be delays because, there's challenges with the community, or there's certain priorities in the community feel haven't been met. And so that's why we always feel like it's really important that in the early planning stages that the community is really involved in contributing to that vision for the infrastructure that will be coming into the community. And so right around 2014, the TCBN formalized as a community labor coalition. And so what we were able to do was, as a community labor coalition, working closely with communities and labor unions, was to actually build a bridge with Metrolinx and government stakeholders who are embarking on this significant infrastructure, and really demand that the community really be involved in the project planning at the early stages. And so the community benefits framework that you outlined was very significant because as a government entity, Metrolinx, committed, in writing in terms of how they were going to respond to the community's demands for, things like access to the skilled trades opportunities, which we knew were going to be good jobs, with pension and benefits, access to professional, administrative, and technical career opportunities as well. And, not only, committing to that, but also putting, staff resources, to help support with the development of the implementation, which we know is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Kumsa. And it's great to hear like the two sides of what does the developer need, what does the community need, and how can we try to streamline that process to make it work for everyone. And I think, Liz, you can add some insight there as well to talk about the journey of creating and supporting the creation of Vancouver's CBA policy and the role of pilots also to figure out how it all works.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Kumsa, hearing you talk about that role of community and how that a lot of that kind of initiative came from the community saying this is something they wanted to see. And I think David mentioned that as well. A lot of those early pilots were really coming from the community saying, this huge development is going to be happening, and how are we going to leverage some of that social value and opportunities that are going to exist on that project, and we're not going to see them if we're not intentional about creating that CBA around it. So as you mentioned, the City of Vancouver's policy passed in 2018, but for probably over a decade before that, there were these pilot projects, whether that's the Olympics, the racecourse track, Park Casino project, and they were all brought about by the community, and then looking at testing different models of setting those targets. What were the enforcement mechanisms that would make sure that those outcomes were actually achieved? What was needed? What was the capacity of the community? What were the project needs? So there was a lot of learning that was able to be established through those projects. And they were also, though, very project specific. And so as we started to see that understanding and growth of those outcomes that were possible on those individual projects, that led to the development of the policy, which now I think also kind of resonating what Kumsa's saying, means that it's built in very early. It's triggered by the rezoning process. So as soon as that project applies for rezoning, that community benefit agreement is triggered, and the community can start to consider what's possible. The owner and developer can start to think about what that's going to look like on the project. And so I think that understanding's really been built into the policy and the framework. When we looked at taking that policy into practice, every project has a project specific working group. There's a citywide working group. So I think what's really come about is this understanding that we learned so much from each of those pilots, and we're going to learn so much from each of these projects that are triggering the CBA. And so we kind of created those spaces to make sure that that learning is built into the implementation process.
Oh, wonderful. And so then to shift gears from kind of the early stages to some of the outcomes, I think it'd be great to hear from all three of you some of the stories of impact and outcomes that you've seen implementing community benefits on these various projects. So maybe Liz, you can start with some of the outcomes you've seen in Vancouver.
Yeah, it's really top of mind because we submitted the first annual report for the new St. Paul's project just a month or so ago. So that's a multi-billion-dollar hospital redevelopment in Vancouver. It's the first project that's triggered the CBA policy. And so as Emma mentioned, the targets on that are the 10% employment and the 10% procurement targets. And so that project is exceeding all of those targets right now, which is fantastic. But I think what really came through was as we started to delve into those numbers and examples, as you said, Emma, it's the stories behind that as well. So some of the highlights in the first year of the project is, for example, with Embers, a local social enterprise that provides staffing solutions. And so they had a member of their organization providing site security. That person expressed interest in getting to know more about the construction sector. And so now has been hired by the general contractor and is starting to go in through a carpentry apprenticeship. Clean Start is another social enterprise in the downtown east side, working with folks that are experiencing barriers to employment. They have now been cleaning trailers for some of the subs on site for the last couple of months. And I think in the report, they were saying they'd been on site for 80 hours, and that was 3 employment roles for folks that Clean Start works with. So the targets are one part of the story and the larger numbers there. But I think when we're starting to say about how do we really connect that to what the community is looking for in terms of outcomes, those are some really great tangible outcomes that we're looking to build on as we go into the next 4 years of the hospital project.
Yeah, amazing. And that's something we hear a lot, that there's the numbers, which are great, but the stories don't always get captured in those statistics either. Jamie, I'd love to hear from you some of what you saw
Yeah, I thought a pretty interesting byproduct of this was that, we had such a, like, I think we were about 99% for our local workforce. So it was very much, a local engagement. And what we've seen as a byproduct was that because everyone was local, there was a lot more willingness to give back to the community. So we always try and do volunteer efforts on projects, and with varying degrees of success. And what we've seen on this project was very successful because people are giving back to their own community as opposed to being, kind of imported into a community, flown in and doing work and trying to give back. So it was a nice byproduct of it for sure that we've seen a lot more engagement from that side of things.
Mhm. And just worth noting, I think you sort of alluded to it, but I think you quadrupled the target hours that you had set for your project, just about. And also the district said that they saw no additional cost to applying the CEB, which is a great tidbit as well. Yeah. Kumsa, I'd love to hear as well from what you've seen on the different LRT projects so far.
Yeah, definitely. It's been quite the learning, I would say, especially starting from the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, which was the first project that we were involved in. I think it was very much of a collaborative effort, I think, from community, labor, the industry. We're actually dealing with a consortium on the Eglinton Crosstown LRT. So there are actually 4 different general contractors that we had to work with, but they were able to identify a community benefits liaison person who would coordinate some of the community benefit activities for the project. And we were able to establish a community benefits plan, and as well as an apprenticeship plan. And so pretty much right before the project started, those plans were established, and it really outlined exactly, what the recruitment would look like, who are the different stakeholders, unions, contractors that would be involved in that phase of the work. And also on the other side, what does the training look like as well? So do we have existing training programs? I know there were new programs that were established specifically to support people from those local communities into those opportunities. And I think from that collaborative approach, and I think by having all stakeholders really vested in seeing this be successful, I think we were able to, see some of the outcomes, especially from the Eglinton Crosstown project, which I think is the one that's most furthest down the line, which is going to be completed quite soon. And so far, we've seen apprenticeships and journey persons, 212 placements under the community benefits program. We've also, through the professional, administrative, and technical careers, even though that there were no targets established, we did see a significant outcomes as well within those opportunities as well, with about 227 placements that were under the community benefits program. They're also reporting on local procurement, so spending locally. We know the significant impacts that the LRT project has had along the Eglinton corridor, especially in areas like Little Jamaica, where some businesses have had to close. And so far, they spent about $9 million in supporting local businesses as much as possible. And we encourage different activities, and we've been supporting different activities as well to create those opportunities for local businesses in the area. And then also social procurement. So social enterprises, there's been about $900,000 spent in supporting social enterprises, and also some of them that we've been working closely with by Social Canada in terms of administrating and some of the different members of Social Canada having access to those social procurement opportunities. And I would say in the long run, we continue to meet quarterly. So I think that's kind of the standard for our community benefit approach for the LRT projects, is having quarterly meetings with the contractor, Metrolinx, government stakeholders, as well as TCPN and some of our community and labor stakeholders. And we're constantly working towards, how do we, further expand the work? How can we, further succeed for things that aren't working? How can we make sure that we're doing our best to achieve those outcomes? And those are similar approaches that we've applied to the Finch West LRT project as well. Right now we're right now in the project planning for 4 more LRT projects in the city of Toronto. And so this past spring, there was a big push to Metrolinx and the provincial government to continue with this approach where we know are creating good jobs and opportunities for people in these local communities. And so, really taking some of the best practices and learnings that we've identified from Eglinton and Finch and really, trying to develop the best program possible. And so, yeah, that's kind of the impact that we've seen, both with these projects, but also setting a model for how we can expand it to new projects in our city. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to see like the immediate impacts and the long-term ecosystem impacts as well. And so all 3 of you have shared sort of some of the community benefits specifically that have come out, but I'd also love to hear, Jamie, what you see as some of the benefits and opportunities of these kinds of projects for the construction industry.
Yeah, for sure. Besides kind of the known benefits of having a diverse workforce, lots of what we've seen was when you have kind of a local community working on your project, they have that local network, they have that local knowledge that they're able to bring to construction. And when you go to different geographical areas, things change. How you actually do your construction changes. And so there are they bring a lot of that knowledge to the project itself. The other thing about construction is things change and emergencies happen and you need something right away. And having that local network, they're able to source materials and the needs of the project a little bit quicker than if you're, reaching out to kind of your known suppliers or contractors that, maybe are 1,000 kilometers away or whatever it may be. So, those were some, very big benefits that we've seen on this particular project. I guess the other thing too that, I looked at, and I just, sorry, I'm drawing a bit of a blank. But yeah, I think really that was the big thing that we've seen. I'm sorry, that's what it was. And we talked about it. The other side of it too is if you're bringing in a workforce from outside of the community, there's additional costs for subsistence and that are added to the project. So there is opportunities there as well to save money from the contractor's point of view. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So a question for all 3 of you now. I'd love to hear what you think is next for social procurement and community benefit agreements in construction, and what is still needed to strengthen this work moving forward. So maybe Kumsa, we could start with you.
Yes, definitely. So what's next for community benefits in construction? I think implementation, definitely, needs a lot more attention and support. I know at the City of Toronto, we have a staff team now that are really involved in really supporting the development of implementation tools to ensure the success of CBAs. I think because we have the City of Toronto really supporting community benefit agreements on more and more projects. We also know that there needs to be that capacity to help support that infrastructure. And so I think implementation tools, are really important currently right now to really help ensure that, what we're hoping to achieve is actually successful. And I think similar type of initiatives need to be taking place at other levels of government, both at a provincial and federal level. I think, community benefits touches many different departments. And so I think, having more collaborative approaches within government to with the money that's being spent, whether it's through procurement or infrastructure, I think there's having that collaboration, I think will really help succeed. And then I think within the broader sort of ecosystem of community benefits, I think really governments taking the lead and also bringing forward community, labor, and private sector stakeholders to really help inform best practices. I know at the City of Toronto, there's an advisory table that's been set up that includes community, labor, and private sector and private sector stakeholders. And representatives from different departments within the city of Toronto to help inform best practices and some of these implementation tools. And then I'd say my last point, I think, is also looking beyond just the infrastructure, but also the supply chain. I think, we're seeing more and more the importance of having strong local supply chains, but also opportunities for those suppliers to also be providing benefits to their local communities as well. And I think that will really help expand and evolve the work of community benefits beyond just where infrastructure is happening, but also in terms of where some of these goods are being supplied from. Thank you.
Yeah, Liz, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the exciting thing that really came from the research is that shift that we've seen to, okay, yes, let's do this, and now let's do it well. So I think, what comes next is starting to build out, exactly like we're doing today, more of those conversations about what is working, what are we doing well, how do we sort of replicate and support that. I think, to add to what Kumsa was saying, that role of policy really came through a lot, that's what's really setting some of that baseline and framework, and we need to see more of that. And then when we shift to the implementation, starting to think about, so what is that method for co-creation and collaboration and communication, which we heard time and time again, is so important to make sure that the CBA is successful. Thinking about the Vancouver example, we've got the policy, we've got some of those tools, we've got the projection tools, the reporting tools that are really starting to collect some of that information we were hearing is needed. What is the project going to need? How do we start to communicate that to the community? So I think that's that next step. We've got the tools and we're starting to collect that information. How do we start to do that matching of the supply and demand that we heard was so important? So in Vancouver, for example, we started to collect that information that we're seeing in the tools, and we started to create spaces. We have a quarterly employment meeting where social enterprises and training groups meet with the subcontractors and the developers and start to exchange that information. So I think that's some of the what's next as well, is developing in the spaces where we don't have the policy, ensuring we keep that momentum going. And when we do, starting to think about how do we co-create and collaborate that together to ensure that we're sharing those best practices and matching that supply and demand.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, what do you think is next and what's needed?
I mean, I agree. I think the biggest thing here is to keep the momentum going, as you said, Liz. I think, you've started to develop a bit of a base and a platform for this, and it's just growing that, being able to collect that information and share it with everyone, and just fine tuning along the way, because I think this is a great and needed initiative, and it's something that can work. It's just we gotta figure it out a little bit along the way.
Mm-hmm. And the flexibility and the willingness to try to get the most from everyone involved is really important. Yeah. There's some questions coming into the chat, and I'd love to open it up for that and then return to one final question for all of you. So we've got one: what are the benefits of putting a CBA in place prior to applying for rezoning? Probably for Liz.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I'm interpreting that question as sort of reiterating that piece about the earlier we can come in, the better. So the benefit of it being built in and being triggered by the rezoning process is that's really early on in the process of these developments and tied to the private development. So now that folks know, and it has that consistency, it's triggered, by projects above this size, they're going through rezoning, they're informed that this CBA is going to be triggered. That's really, months, sometimes even years before the RFPs start to go out to look for the general contractors, before any of those other contracts start to go out for the sub trades. And so, Jamie mentioned that the sooner we know, the sooner all of those stakeholders in that process know that this CBA is coming, the sooner we can start to build that in. We can start to look at what are the project needs. We can start to look at what are the gaps we might need to address. So I think that's one of the benefits of it coming really early on in that process, is sort of setting that expectation and giving all of us, the community and the construction sector, the time to prepare for those opportunities.
Yeah. We have another question here about, did you use social procurement or workforce development on the engineering and consulting team as well as construction contracts? And I think this could be for a number of people, as whether this applied outside of construction.
I can say, at least for our particular project, what we ended up doing was we ended up flowing that language from our prime agreement through to all of our subcontractors, you know, and put it more in a state of, you know, this is gonna help the grading of the tendering process as opposed to these firm objectives that are in place. So I was trying to promote that just far more than just us as the contractor doing it, but trying to extend that to the rest of the groups. And so we did have some engineering firms that were engaged in that, I guess.
This is a great question. How is community engagement formalized, assuming that it is, beyond general public input processes? For example, is a community representative appointed? Are agreements put into place? Maybe Kumsa and Liz, you can.
Yeah, I can definitely respond to that question. I think here in Toronto, the Toronto Community Benefits Network, depending on any project that we're involved in, there's usually an inclusive engagement process with that community. Most of the time, it is the community that takes lead in terms of identifying what are their priorities for community benefits. And as part of that, really trying to see how we can negotiate that. And so TCBN provides a lot of expertise from, you know, some of the different projects that we've been involved in formalizing such agreements. And we provide those tools and know-how to our network members to be able to help negotiate those agreements. And so with Eglinton, with Metrolinx, it was a little bit different because they had a series of projects that were going through many different neighborhoods. And so it was kind of hard to kind of negotiate with one neighborhood. And so TCBN really came in to sort of help support that community benefits framework on behalf of our network members who are in these local neighborhoods. But it does look different from project to project. And so TCBN currently, we do more of a capacity building approach to community benefit agreements, and also have developed our internal capacity to help support with formalizing such agreements, whether it's working with project owners, developers, government, or within the community.
Yeah, I can maybe add to that from the sort of City of Vancouver perspective. So if we think of community broadly, the City of Vancouver's policy requires that each of the projects have an independent third-party monitor. And so that role is really involved in both on the compliance aspect, but also ensuring that throughout the process, you know, those connections are made to local community groups on the employment and the procurement side. And then that role is also being involved in connecting with the broader community. So in Vancouver, we have a community benefit network run by Exchange in a City. And so in that role, the independent third-party monitor is come back to that space, you know, discuss the updates, discuss the projections that have been coming out of that project to ensure that sort of connection is made. And I think that's also then where, as we've been going, we've identified those other, you know, as Kumsa said, it'll be different on different projects, but what are those needs? What are those spaces that need to be created? So is it the quarterly employment meetings where we make sure that the local employment groups are connected? So I think we've got kind of that baseline, and it's great that that role is mandated to ensure that it's there for each project, and then identifying as each project comes up sort of what pockets of community are really engaged and wanting to be made sure that they're included in that process.
Mm-hmm. We have an interesting question here about sort of the scope of the benefits. So when developing CBAs and policies, do you see health and dental or mental health benefits as a feature? So health benefits are impactful for overall outcomes as well. And I think maybe this can get into like, what are the benefits that we're looking for? And Liz, you're sort of saying that as well, like it's different for different communities and for different projects. And Kumsa, you said as well, it's like letting community lead, but I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I would just echo that, Emma. I think, you know, we always say about, if we're thinking about the process, starting first about what are you trying to achieve? What are those social objectives you have? How does that relate to the outcomes that you might want to be looking for? And we kind of refer to those four sort of buckets of employment opportunities, skills and training, social value in the supply chain, and those broader community development goals. And I think, you're right, that's where it is about creating it on a project by project basis to identify what does the community need, what are the kind of capacities of the project, and then matching those things together. So I think that definitely falls into, you know, that broader bucket and conversation around what the community is looking for.
Mm-hmm. Great. So a nice sort of question to tie this all together as we are getting ready to leave for today is, I'd love to ask each of you what advice you have for the folks here as they continue their work to support this paradigm shift that we're seeing. Any final pieces of wisdom to impart? Whoever wants to go first, or I can volunteer someone.
I can go. I guess from, you know, the contractor standpoint, you know, really there's no time to wait. You know, you can kind of start looking into these initiatives now and be prepared for when, you know, it's going to happen on your next project. It's something that we can kind of get ahead of right now as contractors, and I think there's a good opportunity to do so. From the owner side, I think, you know, it's been talked about a lot. Doing that upfront work to really understand what the local community and local market can bear, so that, you know, the goals and objectives that are put forward at the time of tender are achievable. I think that's really important. And then on top of that, not being too heavy-handed with the approach, because, you know, it's a newer initiative, and I think there's a little bit of feeling out that has to happen to really get this thing kicked off in a very positive manner. And I think for everyone, you know, we're looking at a change in kind of how we do business, and so it's keeping an open mind and really being patient with the process.
Yeah, I would just add, I think from more of a community level, I think what CBAs provide is, you know, within infrastructure and development, a level of accountability and transparency. And I think, you know, with that, I think the, you know, the important fundamental pieces like, you know, the establishing of targets, you know, ensuring that there are established processes in place that are prescriptive in contracts and RFPs, you know, making sure that that's downloaded to the subcontractors, you know, ensuring that there's, you know, ongoing, you know, working groups to help monitor that success. I think all of those pieces, I think, are really fundamental to what communities are demanding, which is when these infrastructure projects happen, how do we benefit, but also how do we make sure that our communities are benefiting, right? And you know, I always say that, you know, with every infrastructure projects, there's an opportunity for a legacy to be left. And so I think by working with communities, by really engaging, you know, communities early on in terms of being part of that vision, I think can really help to ensure that with every project that we build, that there is that legacy that's built within building that project, but also long term.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of what Jamie and Kumsa just said and share the wisdom, I think, of what came out of the research, speaking to the folks who are on the ground doing this, who were saying, you know, communicate, co-create, and collaborate. And to Jamie's point, think about, as these projects are coming up and as this is something that we're wanting to leverage, how are we ensuring that that's getting in there as early as possible? From a government perspective, how are we developing that policy that's clear and gives the framework? From an owner perspective, what sort of bidding process are we using to really ensure that it is providing a space that allows for these community benefit agreements? The general contractor, making sure it's in the RFPs. I think it's really just echoing what Jamie's saying about making sure it's in there early. And then in that process, ensuring that we're developing systems where we don't think about it in our silo, but we start to think about how do we co-create and co-deliver this together across owner, community, and the construction sector to, you know, again, reflect what came out of the research. Let's do it and let's do it well. And let's, like Kumsa said, sort of create these lasting legacies so that we're not just building a building, but we're building community.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining today, and especially a really big thanks to Jamie and Kumsa and David and Liz for sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge. It's great to have this conversation and really appreciate everyone's attention and activity in the chat and everything else. And yeah, just good luck on this paradigm shift. Let's all keep working together, collaborating, communicating, and pushing it forward.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.